Hey, in the last video we had a look at string interpolation, the first kind of data binding in Angular 2. In this video we will have a look at property binding, another way of binding data in Angular 2. Now property binding is called property binding because, well, we are binding to properties of an element or of a directive or component we created. So for example here, for our input field, we were using value. This is the normal element or attribute, value attribute of our input field, and we're binding it through string interpolation. Well, we could achieve the same by using squared brackets value equals name. Now, this might look similar, but it is pretty different. This thing here, squared brackets value, is binding to the property value, which is introduced through Angular 2. So it's a property every input element has in an Angular 2 environment to which we can bind. This is very important to understand. That is not a default HTML attribute. It is an Angular 2 property defined for the input element. And to this property we can bind. Now, in the quotation marks, we no longer need to have a string, but we will have an expression which will return something, well, which can be bound there. In this case, this will be a string because we're just binding to this property of our class here, name. So basically this here again could also be 1 equals 1, and if I save this, now we have true in this input field here. And if I revert it to name, well, we again will have max. So this is property binding. We're binding to a property of an element. So that's one form of property binding, when we bind to an already existent HTML element. And as I said, Angular 2 defines properties of those elements. Another way would be to bind to the property of a directive. So if I replace this class thing here with ng class equals and then red, well, it's still working, as you can see. Now ng class is not a property of the input element, it's a directive Angular 2 ships with. So the difference between value and ng class is value is really just an addition of Angular 2 to the input element, as it adds something to a lot of elements where it adds properties to which we can bind. Now ng class is just a general directive which we can set to every HTML element instead of, for example, value, which might not be usable on every HTML element because not all HTML element can use such a value, right? So ng class is a directive and we can apply it to everything in our whole DOM, in our whole HTML code. Now directives also can, but do not have to, take inputs. So for example, the ng class directive needs to know, hey, which class should I attach, right? So the more correct way to use it, by the way, would be to use red true. Save this. So to have this JavaScript object passed to this directive. So the ng class directive needs an input of either a name of a class, if it's only one, like I did before when it just had quotation mark red here, or a JavaScript object where all the classes are defined and whether they should be displayed or used or not. So that is the difference. This ng class takes an input, but it doesn't have to. In later stages of the course, we will get to know ng control, which will basically transform this input to a control in a form, but we will get to that. Now this directive here doesn't take any input. Therefore, we don't have an expression, and therefore we're here not using the squared brackets. Still, this would also be using a directive, but property binding is only if we pass something to that directive here. So, as we are doing here. So I hope that got clear that we can either bind to a default property or to a general directive which happens to take an input. If it doesn't require an input, well, there is no need for data binding. Okay. Another example for binding to a property of an input instead of to a directive is if we use this disabled property here. And if I set this to 1 equals 1, well, then it will be disabled. So now I can no longer enter this text box and type any text here. So that is binding to properties and binding to properties of directives, so properties of elements and properties of directives. Now the third version is something we'll extensively see in this section, is when we bind to properties of our own components. So if you would have a second component here and we were embedding that component here, like the my component we had in earlier videos, well, maybe we wanted to pass a value to that my component, and we would do so by using property binding there. Now how to set this up and use this is something I will show in a later video, but that is another form of using property binding. So that has been a lot of talk about property binding. Key thing to take away is, well, basically property binding means we're using data to change something again, to have it flow into something, and this can be like an HTML element itself by using the properties on this element like value or disabled here, or it can be a directive which then again might change the element it sits on, but the data is flowing into the directive, not into the element itself. That's the key difference. And last version, obviously, creating own components where the data will then flow into that component. So that's property binding. Data flows into something. In the next video, we'll have a look at event binding. See you there. Bye.